body and grinding down the center.
Okay, we'll start with this. You might have heard yesterday, monumental news, that the viewing figures are in for this past weekend's fight between Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano. And it saw an unprecedented audience of 1.5 million on DAZN to achieve a record-breaking viewership night for women's boxing. Fans tune in on DAZN across 170-plus markets worldwide to make the April 30th event the most watched female headline boxing broadcast ever in history. The DAZN app was the highest-grossing sports app globally on Apple and Google over the weekend, as well as the most downloaded sports app in Taylor's home country of Ireland on iOS and Android. In an already historic night that saw Irish superstar Katie Taylor edge out Puerto Rican sensation Amanda Serrano in an epic brawl for the ages to retain her undisputed lightweight crown, an unprecedented audience of 1.5 million tuned in globally on DAZN to set a new women's boxing viewership record. Broadcast from a sold-out crowd of 19,187 folks inside the storied walls of the iconic Madison Square Garden, what's now the most watched female headlined boxing match in history, delivered to the viewers on DAZN, an unforgettable night in which the two fearless warriors traded heavy blows across 10 breathtaking rounds. Of the 170-plus markets that drove global viewership, the United States and the United Kingdom saw the most fans tune in, while Spain, Canada, Ireland, Germany, Australia, Italy, Japan, and Brazil rounded out the top 10.
History was made.
When news broke that this fight was going to be going down the same day as Shakur Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez here on the channel, I talked about how this is actually the bigger fight.
More significant one.
I told you it would prove to be the more entertaining fight because Stevenson versus Valdez had all the makings of a cerebral fight, a chess match, whereas Taylor versus Serrano had more of an air of spontaneity, big questions that needed big answers.
Big statements needed to be made.
My honest opinion is that one fight was a lot more entertaining than the other. It's not even close. That the card in and of itself, the Matchroom card versus the top-ranked card, was comparatively the better, more entertaining card.
Because it had more action fights.
If a fight fan shows up to a fight, they're not showing up to see two guys fence with their jabs. They're not showing up to see two guys play it safe. They're showing up to see somebody get hurt. They show up for the brutality, and there was more brutality on the Matchroom show as opposed to the top-ranked show. That's just reality. Yet in spite of this, there are still people...
If you can believe this, there are actually people that are downplaying the success of this past weekend show.
These monumental viewing figures for a female main event, a female boxing match. Big numbers for a female boxing match. They're breaking barriers. They're breaking that glass ceiling. But if you can believe this, there are actually people that aren't receiving this news well.
There are actually people downplaying the numbers and belittling the fighters.
Not even joking. I don't know what comfort these guys find in trashing the fighters, trashing the fight, the platform, belittling their efforts and their contribution.
I don't know why they take pleasure in that.
Even if women's boxing ain't your cup of tea and DAZN really isn't your desired platform to take in some boxing.
It's all right.
The amount of effort that I saw in some quarters from some individuals, it was peculiar to say the least. And it's the effort that really makes it peculiar. You don't take in women's boxing and you don't think DAZN is all that good a platform.
So then why do you keep up with it?
You take this Chris Rob Will guy, for example. A Twitter user who seems to take great issue with all things Eddie Hearn and all things DAZN. Ahead of this weekend's fight, he says, she probably won't say it, but Taylor will be gutted too, that her biggest moment is hidden on an app that only boxing geeks have rather than on Sky.
That's what he said ahead of the fight. That's what he said before the fight.
After the fight, when the attendance was announced, and so were the viewing figures, that the event in and of itself was a massive hit, a massive success. That same maladjusted Chris guy says, I know I'm labeled anti-DAZN, I'm not, but 1.5 million worldwide audience sounds abysmal to me, about 8,000 per territory, and this is their own number rather than anything independently verified.
So Feist, the guy, says that nobody's gonna watch this thing, only so that when it turns out people did watch it...
Remember what this genius said? He said it's hidden away on an app. I don't think over 19,000 people at an iconic venue like Madison Square Garden.
Hidden away? What does he mean, hidden away?
Well, he's one of these self-important pricks, thinks he's the smartest guy in the room when he don't know the ball from the bounce.
You get the sense he thinks he's funny or charming.
Guy's a fucking idiot and a flip-flopper. Before the fight, you say nobody's gonna watch it, so that when it turns out a lot of people watched it, and a lot of people turned up...
You said it was hidden away. If it was hidden away, how'd 19,000 people know about it?
You said it was hidden away. If it was hidden away, how did 1.5 million people across 170 territories know about it?
According to this member of MIMSA, it was hidden away.
Nobody should have known about it. The truth is, unfortunately, this guy's not alone. There are a lot of guys like this. Now, what they get out of being this way, your guess is as good as mine.
I don't get it. What, does it make you feel like more of a man putting two ladies down?
You stupid or something? What's the matter with you?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of sarcastic little pricks like this one.
They actually take pleasure in belittling the fighters, belittling their efforts.
Because of people like this, that there's more work needs doing.
Taylor versus Serrano turned out to be a massive hit. Turned out to be a massive success. It sold out the Garden and received worldwide attention across a large area.
But it can't be the only fight of its kind.
It can't be a singular event, a flash in the pan, one moment, just one moment in time where a lot of people stopped and watched. We need more fights like this, more moments like this, more marketing, more promotion.
Which draws in more eyes and generates more revenue.
More incentives for the fighters to fight, more incentives for the promoters and the platforms to put those fights on. This past weekend's fight was, in fact, a monumental success, whether guys like Chris like it or not.
Those two broads fought in front of 19,000 people this past weekend and made history. What the fuck did you do?
Makes snarky comments on social media, and I'm sure he's very proud of himself.
There's more work needs doing.
The attendance for the fight was great. The viewing figures are great.
But there's more work needs doing.
The buck don't stop there. It really doesn't. And that is the advantage that a global streaming service as opposed to a localized one has, that they can attract viewership from different corners.
They're not relying on one singular market.
They're drawing a lot of eyes over a large area, so every one of those individual territories.
You know that you got eyes over there, so that's a market you can hope to grow and expand.
As stated, the buck don't stop there. Whether guys like Chris like it or not, this past weekend's fight was in fact a success that drew a lot of eyes, got a lot of attention.
Every single one of that 1.5 million is a paying customer.
Because this ain't free TV, where when DAZN launched, you had a lot of people forecasting its downfall, its bankruptcy. It seems that DAZN is thriving and their audience is expanding because they got these viewing figures for a women's boxing match.
What are they going to get this upcoming weekend for Canelo's fight?
What kind of viewing figures are they going to get for Joshua versus Usyk too?
There's a lot of opportunity there, but as stated, there is more work needs doing.
But hey, I told you. People are going to want to see this fight, and people did. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, ahead of his big light heavyweight showdown this weekend, Canelo Alvarez on David Benavidez versus David Lemeiux, and Charlo versus Maciej Sulecki. I don't need to say anything. The media, you need to look at what they do and what I do. It's different. It's a big difference.
Yeah, I think that goes without saying.
Canelo is a more active fighter than his contemporaries. He does fight more often than they do against more world champions, active reigning world champions in succession. And this is often downplayed in some circles, small ones. But if it were easy to do, why don't you see Charlo doing it? Why don't you see David Benavidez doing it? If it's as easy to do, if it's as easy as Canelo Alvarez's critics say it is, then why aren't they doing it?
Why isn't the media holding them accountable?
Never mind Canelo's critics. The guy's on the ground, critical of who he's fighting, dissatisfied that he's taking on Dimitri Bivol as opposed to David Benavidez or Charlo. Never mind them, because there really aren't a lot of them to begin with. They don't actually make up a large consumer base. The fighters they support.
Look at their metrics.
Look at their viewing figures. Look at the attendance for their fights. Look at what those fights generate.
It's not even close.
I tell you guys here on the channel all the time that in spite of what content some content creators might upload to their channels here on YouTube, and the success that they're having with those uploads, you know, it's very lucrative to criticize Canelo Alvarez these days, if you're a YouTuber.
Yeah, you can make a lot of money criticizing Canelo on YouTube.
You can make a lot of money criticizing him and talking up fighters like Charlo or Errol Spence Jr. You can make yourself a pretty penny doing that, believe it or not, on YouTube.
Yeah, bigger channels than this one do it all the time.
Problem is, those bigger channels don't cater to an actual consumer base, an actual paying audience that pays for boxing, no matter what their metrics are here in this digital environment on YouTube. They don't actually represent the majority of boxing fans that pay for boxing, that pay to attend a fight or pay to see one at home by way of pay-per-view. The problem is that the metrics are deceptive. It might seem like there are no shortage of channels criticizing Canelo Alvarez, criticizing him for his fighting. It might seem like Charlo has a big following or Errol Spence Jr. has a big following. Based on those metrics and what content those content creators create, it might seem that way, but they're catering to an audience,
of bums,
no matter how large it seems it is,
of freeloaders,
of moochers, guys who don't actually pay for a pay-per-view. Rather, they resort to illegally streaming fights. Even when it comes to fighters, they claim to support
fighters like Charlo, fighters like Errol Spence Jr.
Errol Spence Jr. and Canelo Alvarez have both been on pay-per-view in the last 12 months, and their viewing figures, the pay-per-view buy rate for their pay-per-views, it's not even close.
Yeah, it might seem like Errol's got a lot of support by way of social media.
And some content creators here on YouTube make themselves a pretty penny talking him up, though in reality,
in the real world, he doesn't generate the kind of interest Canelo generates because he doesn't have as big a fan base.
You're never going to get around that. This is prize fighting after all.
Canelo Alvarez ends up getting bigger prizes because he's got a bigger following.
Now here is where it gets interesting. Why does Canelo Alvarez have a bigger following? Well, maybe it's because he actually fights in fights that people want to see.
People pay to see him.
Whereas a lot of the support that Errol Spence Jr. and Charlo, David Benavidez, a lot of the support they seem to get online seems to be coming from guys that don't actually pay for boxing.
That's why Errol only drew 240,000-ish pay-per-view buys
to Canelo Alvarez's 800,000 on the same network. Bear in mind, their last pay-per-view appearances came by way of the same premium cable network, and the numbers, they're not even close.
Yeah, maybe Errol does have a lot of people talking about him online, but a lot of those guys are bums.
These are guys that illegally stream boxing. These are guys who illegally stream fights. Even when it comes to fighters, they claim to support. Thus, their opinions on the sport of boxing.
What you think about boxing is irrelevant.
It's irrelevant because you don't pay for it. What do you think? The fighters care what you think? The promoters, the platforms? You think they care?
You think they care what a guy living in his mother's basement, stealing fights and streaming them?
Who gives a fuck what you think about boxing?
Freeloader.
Fucking bums. Coincidentally, these fucking bums have got the most say, the most criticism for Canelo Alvarez, and go out of their way to be heard.
Irrelevant.
Canelo tells the media, you need to look at what they do and what I do. It's different. There's a big difference, a glaring difference. And I think that the media themselves, the American media in boxing, they don't hold these fighters accountable.
How many times did you see Charlo shoot down a Demetrius Andrade fight? How many times did you see him shoot down a David Benavidez fight?
Guy who fought once all of last year against an unheralded opponent, and now he's actually fighting a guy that was beaten 2 years ago by Demetrius Andrade after having already turned down Demetrius Andrade. I mean, let me jog your memory. Eddie Hearn offered this guy something like $7 million to come over to the DAZN side of things and let them pay for the fight. They didn't want to go for that. Then Eddie Hearn offers to send Demetrius over to Showtime, and PBC's Tom Brown, he didn't want to pay for that.
So you don't want to let Eddie pay for it, and you don't want to pay for it either.
Because you don't want to fight. You don't want to fight Demetrius Andrade. You'd rather fight a guy that he beat 2 or 3 years ago instead.
And the American media seems to let him get away with it.
The American media lets David Benavidez get away with turning down a David Morrell fight so that he could fight a very past-it David Lemeiux instead. They don't actually hold these guys accountable for the business decisions and management.
They don't.
I don't want to do things like that, right? In Cashaway 164, why me? I don't need to do that.
It's Canelo Alvarez addressing the proposition that he might face Errol Spence Jr. at a catch weight of 164 pounds, and you heard what he said. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't need to do that. I told you in my previous video, this is not a guy who's strapped for cash.
He's not.
This is not a guy who's looking for a payday because he is the payday.
The American media is letting these guys get away with sitting on their hands.
Whilst Canelo Alvarez takes on unbeaten champion after unbeaten champion after unbeaten champion across 2 weight classes, you can't get these guys.
Why are we hearing about Errol Spence Jr. versus Canelo when he's got an unbeaten champion right there in his own weight class?
Got Terrence Crawford. If the people at Showtime have all this money to offer Canelo Alvarez, why don't they offer Terrence Crawford some of that money and see about doing that fight? Put some of that money into the promotion so that you can ensure it's a successful pay-per-view, a successful event involving 2 homegrown American fighters, American champions who are widely regarded as 2 of the pound-for-pound best fighters in the sport. Why doesn't Showtime have the energy for that fight that they have for Canelo Alvarez? Seems to me you were just willing to sacrifice Errol Spence Jr., put him in a situation, in a fight, that he stands little to no chance of winning so that you can maintain a relationship with Canelo.
We talked about this, and it gets repetitive after a while.
But it needs to be said because the American media isn't holding these other fighters accountable. These other fighters who keep playing it safe, hoping they'll win the sweepstakes with Canelo Alvarez. I mean, how many fighters across how many weight classes?
We shouldn't be hearing about Spence versus Canelo.
The only reason we are hearing about it is because Tom Brown of the PBC, who promotes Errol Spence Jr.'s fights, he's the one that said they offered Spence to Canelo Alvarez.
It's the only fucking reason we're hearing about it. I didn't make it up.
Canelo, in so many words, told those guys he doesn't need them. He doesn't need Spence.
What the fuck's he need a welterweight for?
The fuck's he need with a welterweight? What's Errol Spence Jr. got that he needs? What world title at what weight that Canelo Alvarez can win? What are we talking about here?
What?
This kind of behavior, this kind of management in the sport of boxing, it comes at a great detriment to the sport, because when you have that many guys spread out across that many weight classes, playing it safe, all hoping to fight the same guy, one guy, other fights don't happen.
You got a welterweight that wants to fight him.
A middleweight, a super middleweight. There are still hardcore boxing fans that would like to see Canelo shoot for undisputed at light heavyweight. I mean, what is that, 4 weight classes worth of guys?
Ridiculous.
And the American media, the American pundits, they're not really holding them accountable for this, that there are other fights out there, perhaps not as lucrative as the Canelo Alvarez fight, but Canelo can't be expected to fight guys across 4 weight classes.
He's taking on an unbeaten light heavyweight in his prime this weekend.
An unbeaten light heavyweight champion in his prime, with a pesky-based style that's responsible enough that this could be a challenge. Dimitri Bivol could actually give Canelo Alvarez some issues, and you still see some...
Well, you got guys complaining about who Canelo's fighting, but they're not complaining about who David Benavidez is fighting.
David Benavidez is fighting David Lemieux. That doesn't bother you? It doesn't bother you that he turned down a fight with unbeaten David Morrell, a far more interesting opponent choice. He turned that down so he could fight David Lemieux.
What would you fucks rather see? Because I'm getting the fight I wanted to see.
Anybody that follows this channel knows I identified Dimitri Bivol as a more challenging, more dangerous opponent than Charlo.
Certainly a more challenging opponent than Errol Spence Jr.
While I will admit that a David Benavidez fight might have a very pleasing aesthetic, given the clash of styles, Dimitri Bivol is just as good, if not better, because he's an unbeaten light heavyweight champion at a higher weight than David.
These mongoloids tell themselves that David Benavidez is only fighting David Lemieux because Canelo ducked.
There is no limit, no shortage of asinine comments from Canelo Alvarez's critics who don't represent the consumer anyway, so who really gives a fuck what they think?
Get them, but I think it's high time the American media hold these fighters and their promoters responsible.